Hello, students. I'm Christopher Hanlon of Eastern Illinois University.
And I'm David Rabin, here with another installment of the Close Reading Cooperative.
And it has been a great start, I think, to the Close Reading Cooperative.
It's been wonderful.
It's been a productive semester. But the semester is almost at an end here at Eastern Illinois University. And so we at the Close Reading Cooperative are going to take a brief hiatus, just, for the winter break, a few weeks off.
And we've been thinking about what's appropriate for this end of one semester and the beginning of another semester, something that's ending but not yet quite beginning. Yeah. And we figured it's enjambment.
Enjambment, clearly enjambment. I love enjambment.
And what's not to love about enjambment?
It's an end that isn't an end.
You take a line of poetry, and instead of ending it where the reader expects it to end, you kind of continue it, don't you?
You continue it onto the next line. That's enjambment.
Now, we're going to give a couple of examples here. The first example is of a passage that is end-stopped.
Okay, now this is a piece of poetry from Walt Whitman, from his 1855 edition of Leaves of Grass. There was never any more inception than there is now, nor any more youth or age than there is now, and will never be any more perfection than there is now, nor any more heaven or hell than there is now. And that, of course, is a quote from Walt Whitman's 1855 edition of The Leaves of Grass.
And Whitman is wonderful. He's also wonderful when, instead of end-stopping his lines, he enjambs one line so that it continues on to the next. And here's another example.
Okay. And here's a moment from Whitman's earlier poem, Blood Money, which was published in Harper's in 1843. Of olden time, when it came to pass that the beautiful God Jesus should begin his work on earth, then went Judas and sold the divine youth and took pay for his body. Now, he doesn't enjam often, but when he does, it's really noticeable, isn't it?
It's very noticeable, and the question is, what's the effect of this enjambed line?
Right, and that enjambed line, of course, would be in the beginning there, right? With that word pass, which sort of pulls us along to the second line rather than end-stopping the way Whitman does in the later poem. And I guess one effect is that, well, it just pulls us along, right? Right? Whereas the earlier poem ends every line with this end of a grammatical unit. Here we have a moment where the grammatical unit is stretched between the two, and it kind of prevents us from pausing, for one thing.
That's right. And it puts the stress in a different place, sometimes perhaps where we weren't expecting it to be, and that makes it even more important that the stress comes there.
And I suppose, in the case of Whitman, the passage that has all these end-stop lines creates a sense of parallelism. And if we think back to a few podcasts back when C.C. Worm and Susie Park were talking to us about hypotaxis and parataxis, there's a kind of paratactic effect here.
Because when you have end-stopped lines, you have to have short syntactic units. But once you can use enjambment, it invites us to have more complex sentence structures, to have longer units, and to start getting very involved with ideas as well as with meanings.
That's right. And obviously all of this has ramifications for sound. And I think in that spirit, David, we might move to another couple of examples that we have from Shakespeare here. Perhaps first, if you would be willing to read for us here, an example of Shakespeare end-stopping his lines.
Now, this example is from Julius Caesar, Act 3, Scene 2, where Mark Antony is speaking his great funeral oration after Caesar's death. He was my friend, faithful and just to me. But Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man. He had brought many captives home to Rome, whose ransoms did the general coffers fill. Did this in Caesar seem ambitious? When that the poor have cried, Caesar hath wept. Ambition should be made of sterner stuff. Yet Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man.
No, the sound here is really declarative, and there are these strong pauses at the end of each line.
And it allows for that powerful irony each time we get repeated. Brutus is an honorable man as this self-enclosed statement that isn't true.
Yeah, he isolates those statements in a way that requires us to scrutinize. Right. Now, I'm also thinking now that, so that's an example of Shakespeare and stopping. Now let's take a look at Shakespeare in jamming. And what I was thinking is this equally indicting passage from Shakespeare's later play, The Tempest.
And what we have here is Caliban speaking about the usurpation of the island by Prospero and how it ought to belong to himself, Caliban. This island's mine by Sycorax my mother, which thou takest from me. When thou camest first, thou stokest me and made much of me, and wouldst give me water with berries in it, and teach me how to name the bigger light, and how the less that burn by day and night. And then I loved thee, and showed thee all the qualities of the isle, the fresh springs, brine pits, barren places and fertile. Cursed be I that did so. All the charms of Sycorax, toads, beetles, bats, light on you.
David, it's not me. It's Prospero. It's Caliban and Prospero.
I know. I can't help but feel the power of those lines, partly because they just keep, it runs on. And then you can have internal rhymes with the powerful effect of the internal rhyme when we're not expecting it there. But that he has to say, when thou camest first, thou stokest me. That line just pulls us on it, eases us into the passage until we get that final statement, cursed be I that did so.
Yeah, and that sticks out, I mean, to me as a reader, because the line right before it end stops. And it's the first time he's end stopped.
It's the first time he's end stopped, and then he can, after this short line, he can give another enjambed line where he gives his first great curse, all the charms of Sycorax, toads, beetles, bat, light on you.
Sometimes I wish I was a Shakespearean.
Yes.
He could write.
He learned a great deal from Chaucer.
Okay, so as always, students, part of the payoff for you as English majors here is that you need to be the first person in your next class that deals with poetry to point out a moment where the writer is using enjambment and to offer a theory about why and how.
And you start looking for it. You start thinking about how we're drawn on from one line to the next and how that affects us when we come to a shorter line that isn't enjambed, and you can start understanding how poetry works.
That's right, and as a matter of fact, I want to invite you to log on to our website, or our Facebook site rather, the Close Reading Cooperative, and let us know how it went. Tell a story about the moment when you, the student, stood up and just knocked everyone's heads off by pointing out where enjambment occurs in the passage you're studying.
And thank you, Chris, for inviting me here today. I'll remember this moment between times.
Thank you for coming, David. And it's been fun so far, students. We'll see you at the beginning of the next line of the Close Reading Cooperative during the spring semester. Bye-bye.